13,400 years ago, on the banks of the Nile, someone died with a stone point buried in their ribs. Look closer. That wound had already healed. Bone had grown back around it. Someone fed this person. Someone kept them warm while their body fought to survive. And then a second wound killed them. Different weapon, different angle, a different hand, holding a different spear. This is Jebel Sahaba, one of the oldest mass graves ever found, and it forces a question we still can't fully answer. Did we invent war? Or did something inside us always know how to do this? Here's the distinction that matters. An army has a birthday, a king who raised it, a treasury that paid for it, a date you can circle on a map. Coordinated group violence has no birthday at all. It fades backward into the dark, past written history, past cities, maybe past our own species. One of those is a human invention. The other might be something we were born already carrying. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly where that line sits and why it should unsettle you. If questions like this keep you up thinking, hit subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of question. Go back to 1964. An archaeologist named Fred Windorf is digging along the Nile in Sudan at a site now called Jebel Sahaba. He uncovers 61 skeletons. Many have stone points still lodged in bone, arrowheads, spear tips, driven in with enough force to chip the vertebrae. For decades, this looked like one bad day, one raid, one massacre, over almost as fast as it began. Then, in 2021, researcher Isabelle Crèvecoeur at the University of Bordeaux ran those same 61 skeletons through modern microscopy Wendorf never had. She and her team found over 100 previously undocumented healed and unhealed lesions. In total, 41 of the 61 individuals, 67%, showed at least one healed or unhealed injury, and 92% of those injuries came from projectiles or close combat. Here's the detail that rewrote the story. A quarter of the skeletons with injuries carried both healed and unhealed trauma on the same body, proof they survived one attack, healed, and were struck again. That takes weeks to months. This wasn't a massacre, it was a pattern, most likely tied to climate change squeezing groups onto the same shrinking strip of fertile land at the end of the Ice Age. And nearly equal numbers of men and women were buried here. 48.7% female, 51.3% male, with children among them too. Not soldiers, a neighborhood. Which means the earliest evidence of organized human violence isn't a battlefield, it's a repeating pattern of ordinary lives, interrupted again and again. Around 10,000 years ago, near what's now Lake Turkana in Kenya, a Turkana fossil hunter named Pedro Ebeya spotted human bone fragments scattered on the surface at a place called Nataruk. Cambridge researcher Marta Mirazon-Lar led the excavation that followed, and what her team uncovered forced a hard look at when human violence actually began. They recovered the remains of 27 people, 20 adults, 6 young children, and 1 teenager. 12 of the skeletons were found intact, never buried, preserved in the mud of a dried lagoon, and 10 of those 12 showed unmistakable violence. Crushed skulls, broken hands and ribs, arrow wounds to the neck. 2 of the men had stone projectile tips still lodged in skull and chest, some made of obsidian, a volcanic glass not naturally found in that stretch of Turkana, meaning the weapons themselves belonged to outsiders. At least 1 woman was found with her hands bound. Here is why this site matters more than its body count. For years, one theory held that organized violence needed farming first, that only once people had fields and grain silos worth defending did group conflict emerge. Nataruk breaks that theory apart. The event dates to between 9,500 and 10,500 years ago, squarely in a hunter-gatherer world with no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no stored surplus. These were nomadic foragers, carrying nothing they couldn't walk away with. So if organized group violence can happen without farms, without cities, without anything fixed worth stealing, the old explanation collapses, which leaves a harder question standing in its place. If it isn't property driving this, what is? If coordinated group killing predates farmland, predates cities, maybe it predates our species entirely. That question set researchers looking somewhere unexpected. Not older ruins, but a living population. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, sharing roughly 98% of our DNA. In 1974, at Gombe National Park in Tanzania, primatologist Jane Goodall watched one unified chimp community fracture. A splinter group of 6 adult males, 12 females, and their young broke away and settled to the south, and Goodall named them the Kahama community. The remaining Kasakela community kept 8 adult males and 12 adult females. What followed wasn't posturing. On January 7, 1974, 6 Kasakela males formed a raiding party, crossed into Kahama territory, found a lone male named Godi, and beat him to death. The first time researchers had ever documented one chimpanzee deliberately killing another. Witnesses recorded the killers celebrating afterward, hooting and dragging branches. It wasn't isolated. Over 4 years, Kasakela males systematically hunted down and killed every male in the Kahama community. 6 confirmed dead, 1 more missing and presumed dead, while 3 Kahama females were beaten and later absorbed into the victorious group. Researchers now call it the Gombe Chimpanzee War. Goodall herself described the psychological toll of watching it. She wrote that she struggled for years to process what she'd seen, and that when she woke at night, the images returned uninvited. Here's the logical weight this carries. Chimpanzees split from the ancestral line we share roughly 6 to 7 million years ago. If coordinated lethal group violence shows up on both branches of that split, in chimps and in humans, the simplest explanation isn't that we each invented it separately. It's that the capacity was already sitting in the ancestor we both came from. That doesn't settle whether war is destiny. It just moves the question further back than any battlefield, any government, any human city ever built. 2 of the researchers behind the Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba findings landed on opposite conclusions about what it all means, and the disagreement runs straight through the field. On one side, archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, whose 1996 book War Before Civilization argued that violence has always run deep in human groups, later joined by psychologist Steven Pinker, who compiled death rates across dozens of pre-state societies and found startlingly high proportions of adult men dying by violence. Evidence, they argued, that warlike behavior is ancient and built into us. On the other side, anthropologist R. Brian Ferguson of Rutgers, alongside Douglas Fry and Patrick Soderberg, whose 2013 study in the journal Science took a harder look at that same body of evidence. They examined 21 mobile forager-band societies and found that more than half of all lethal events were carried out by a single person acting alone. Not coalitions, not raiding parties. Out of 148 killings recorded across those societies, only 2 were fought over resources like hunting grounds or water. The rest traced back to jealousy, family feuds, executions of people who'd broken social rules, or accidents. Fry and Soderberg's conclusion? What looks like primitive warfare in the historical record is mostly homicide misfiled under the wrong label. So which camp is right? Here's the honest answer. Probably both, depending on the question you're actually asking. Keeley and Pinker are measuring whether humans are capable of sustained, lethal, coordinated violence. And Jebel Sahaba and Gombe already answered that. Fry and Ferguson are measuring something narrower, whether that violence was typically organized as group versus group warfare among the earliest nomadic societies. And their data says usually it wasn't. Which means the 2 studies aren't actually contradicting each other. They're describing 2 different ingredients. One is the raw capacity for violence, sitting in us since before we were even human. The other is the specific machinery of war, planning, coalitions, repeat campaigns against an enemy, which doesn't show up nearly as often in bands with nothing fixed to fight over. That distinction is about to matter a lot. Here's where the story pivots. 2 studies just showed us something contradictory. Chimps kill in coalitions, but nomadic human foragers mostly kill each other one-on-one over jealousy and grudges, not organized raids. So what actually flips a species from capable of violence into capable of war? The answer isn't in the killers, it's in what they had to lose. For nearly the entire span of human existence, people carried everything they owned. If a rival group showed up, you didn't fight, you walked. There was nothing fixed on the ground worth dying over. That changed roughly 12,000 years ago, when humans in the Fertile Crescent began planting grain and penning animals. For the first time, survival was tied to a specific patch of dirt. You couldn't outwalk a harvest still in the ground. Jericho shows exactly what that shift looked like in stone. Around 8000 BCE, its residents built an 8.5-meter stone tower, part of a wall up to 3.6 6 meters high and 1.8 meters thick, enclosing roughly 4 hectares, one of the earliest large-scale construction projects in human history. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated the site through the 1950s, argued it functioned as a defensive watchtower, built to protect a settlement that finally had something worth protecting: stored grain, livestock, a fixed home. But the evidence doesn't point in only one direction. Archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef proposed an alternative in 1986, that the tower and wall were built to hold back seasonal flooding, not enemies. Both readings remain live in the field. We don't get to pretend this one's settled. What we can say is this: whatever the wall's primary job was, its existence tells you people had, for the first time, something stationary enough to need guarding at all. Then there's Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic settlement in Turkey occupied from roughly 7100 to 6000 BCE, housing between 3,000 and 10,000 people at its peak, and it took the opposite architectural approach. No wall anywhere. Instead, houses were built wall to wall in a dense honeycomb with no streets, no alleys, and no ground-level doors at all. Residents climbed in through holes in the roof, using ladders they could pull up behind them. There was no perimeter to breach because there was no way in to begin with. The defense wasn't a wall facing outward. It was the entire town folded inward on itself. Two settlements, same rough era, same underlying problem, and two completely different answers, both engineered around the same fear, that something fixed in place can be taken. That's the moment the math changes. Once you can't run, you either build a wall or you make the whole town impossible to walk into. Once farmland gave people something fixed to lose, the next shift was fast. And it shows up in stone almost immediately. Around 2450 BCE, in the Sumerian city of Lagash, a ruler named Eannatum commissioned a monument to celebrate crushing his neighboring city, Umma, in a war over a fertile strip of farmland called Guadin, wedged between the two cities. That monument, the Stela of Vultures, shows something historians consider the first documented military formation in human history. Rows of armored infantry marching in tight ranks, shields locked together in front, spears angled forward through the gaps, centuries before Greek hoplites would fight the same way at Marathon. This wasn't a raiding party grabbing what it could and running. This was drilled, coordinated infantry moving as a single unit built for one purpose: to mow down or terrify anything standing in front of it. That's the first marker of real war. Not just violence, but violence engineered and rehearsed in advance. The second marker follows about a century later, and it's arguably the bigger leap. Around 2334 BCE, a ruler known as Sargon of Akkad did something no one before him is recorded doing. He kept an army standing year-round, war or no war. His core force numbered roughly 5,400 professional soldiers, men who didn't return to farms between campaigns, whose entire job was combat readiness. Think about what that number actually means. Every one of those soldiers had to be fed, armed, and paid whether a war was happening or not. That's only possible in a society already producing enough surplus grain to support people who make nothing edible at all. This is the moment war stops being a response to a threat and becomes a tool a ruler keeps in his pocket, ready whenever he decides to use it. Not defense, policy. For most of this story, we've been reconstructing war from bones and broken stone. We've had to infer, estimate, argue about interpretation. Then, in 1457 BCE, that changes completely. At Megiddo in modern Israel, Pharaoh Thutmose III led Egyptian forces against a coalition of Canaanite rulers. And this time, a scribe named Tijanini was standing there recording it. Egyptian forces, roughly 10,000 strong, faced a similarly sized coalition army, and the account carved afterward into the temple walls at Karnak didn't just claim victory, it listed exactly how many enemy soldiers were killed, how many captured, troop movements, tactical decisions, the pharaoh's own reasoning about which route to take into battle. Historians consider it the first battle in human history documented in genuinely reliable detail, the exact point where archaeology hands the story off to written record. Look at what happened in under 1,000 years. Coordinated formations, a professional standing army, a meticulously documented campaign with a body count. Each step didn't just add more violence, it added infrastructure, organization, institutions built specifically to make violence repeatable, on command, at scale. That's not an ancient instinct flaring up, that's an instinct being handed tools it never had before. And once a society builds those tools, it rarely puts them back down. Every escalation so far has been about scale. More soldiers, more organization, bigger stakes. But there's a separate escalation happening at the same time, one that's easy to miss. The weapons themselves start changing purpose. Look at nearly every tool humans made before the mace. The spear, the bow, the flint knife, all of them started as survival equipment. You hunted with a spear before you ever pointed it at another person. The mace breaks that pattern completely. A carved stone head fixed to a handle, built with one function, to crush a human skull. It's not a hunting tool someone repurposed in anger. It's the first object in the archaeological record designed from the ground up for exactly one job: killing people. And almost immediately, it stops being just a weapon and becomes a symbol. On the Narmer palette, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Egyptian art, the king isn't shown farming or praying, he's shown gripping a mace, mid-swing over a kneeling enemy. Political power and the tool built for killing become the same image. Rulers weren't just using this weapon, they were branding themselves with it. Around the same era in Spain, Levantine rock art shows something else entirely new. Ferguson noted that prehistoric artistic representations of combat and homicide serve as one of the clearest markers archaeologists use to identify warfare in societies without writing. These painted scenes, rows of archers facing off, figures collapsing under arrows, are considered among the oldest surviving images of organized combat anywhere in the world. War wasn't just being fought. It was being recorded deliberately for others to see. Then the scale jumps again. Around 1250 BCE, in the Tallense Valley in northern Germany, something happened that shouldn't have been possible according to what we thought we knew about the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have recovered over 12,500 bones from at least 150 individuals, and researchers estimate more than 2,000 combatants took part. Warriors who isotope analysis shows came from hundreds of miles away, some from as far as southern Germany and Scandinavia. A quarter of the skeletons carried healed wounds from earlier fights, meaning these weren't farmers grabbing sticks, they were experienced fighters. Nobody expected Bronze Age Northern Europe to be capable of assembling something this large. And then there's Crow Creek, South Dakota, around 1325 CE. A massacre, not a battle. Archaeologists recovered the remains of at least 486 men, women, and children, and 90% of the skulls bore cut marks consistent with scalping. The likely trigger, researchers believe, was a period of severe drought and failing crops, an entire community erased over dwindling resources. Put these together and the trajectory is unmistakable. A weapon built purely to kill. Art made to broadcast violence. Battles fought by strangers pulled from hundreds of miles apart, and a whole village left with nothing standing at all. Here's the paradox sitting underneath everything you've just seen. The same species capable of healing a wounded stranger's ribs at Jebel Sahaba is capable of scalping 486 people at Crow Creek. That's not two different kinds of human, it's one brain running two different settings. Psychologists have a name for the switch: in-group and out-group categorization. Your brain doesn't treat every person you meet with the same weight. It sorts people almost instantly, us or them. In 1970, psychologist Henry Tajfel ran a now-famous experiment where he split strangers into groups using something as meaningless as a coin flip. No shared history, no real stakes. Within minutes, people started favoring their randomly assigned team over the other one, even when there was nothing to gain from it. That's how shallow the trigger can be. Once someone gets filed under them, something measurable changes. Brain imaging research has shown that the neural circuits responsible for empathy, the ones that light up when you watch someone you know get hurt, respond far less strongly when the person suffering has been mentally sorted as an outsider. The empathy isn't gone, it's just been switched off for that particular person. This is the mechanism, not a metaphor. It's the same wiring letting a soldier grieve his own fallen friend in the morning and feel nothing pulling the trigger on a stranger that afternoon. And it hasn't gone anywhere. You can watch it happen today in rival fan bases turning ugly, in political arguments where the other side stops being wrong and starts being the enemy. Different stakes, same ancient switch, still working exactly as it did 10,000 years ago. So, did we invent war? No. What we invented was the machinery. The switch that lets empathy shut off, that's old. Older than farming, older than cities, maybe older than our own species. Sitting quietly in whoever we share ancestors with in Gombe. What's newer is everything else. The stored grain worth killing for, the standing army, the mace built for nothing but a human skull. Go back to that riverbank in Sudan. Someone was hurt, and someone else fed them, kept them warm, waited for the bone to knit back together. Weeks of care. Then someone killed them anyway. Both of those people are still in us. The one who heals? The one who ends it? 13,000 years hasn't changed which switch gets flipped, only how far the consequences reach once it does. That's worth sitting with longer than tonight. If this kind of question is your kind of question, subscribe. There's more like it coming.